I think I want to start off this discussion just by talking a little bit about the stigma that both of you mentioned in your introductions. Especially being of South Asian descent, my parents are also first generation immigrants. I also, we all moved here together like 15 years ago. So I think just with that perspective, there's a lot of hesitation sometimes when you're talking about things related to mental health. Like if I'm struggling with something, whether that be, anything related to social, like my social behavior at school, issues with friends, all of that kind of stuff, there was always a little bit of hesitation. Like, should I talk to my parents about this? And I think personally, it's always been a sign of weakness almost. I think that's the perspective that a lot of my peers experience when we're discussing things related to mental health. Just sharing that you're struggling with something or sharing that you're going through something that's tough with anybody around you, whether that be your friends, your parents, your teachers, your supervisors, anybody. It's like a sense of shame almost. And I think a lot of us have felt that kind of guilt. So just starting off with that discussion, what are your perspectives on overcoming this kind of sense of guilt or this sense of weakness when seeking help?
So I can start from a parent perspective. I think sometimes it is based on the parents, culture and what kind of role model they have been for their children. So if as a parent, I always say, oh, I'm having a bad day or I feel guilty about, my mental health, my own, self-care, then that's going to trickle down in my family. And that's like a first-hand experience that I had. I mean, because of my training, I was more open to these conversations. So when my older child, who is non-binary, so they that was another issue that was going on with them at that time, and they were pretty open to coming to me and kind of sharing, whatever that they were going through. And as we were in the middle of pandemic, I was able to recognize the signs between, what is seen as a typical kind of like, high school kind of situation or something really that needed intervention. So I would say as parent, it is our role to kind of model that behavior for our children. So that's what I would share.
After having done the book and after having lived my own personal experience with the mental health journey, I do agree with what you're saying, that the hesitancy I'm seeing both in myself and as well as a lot of people who told their stories in my book, is the hesitancy to tell parents they're struggling does come from having been nurtured that admitting to or giving into your feelings is quote unquote weakness, and therefore that's admitting failure, and admitting to having a mental health disorder is a sign of defeat, and God forbid you do that if you're an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. I think is the barrier that I most commonly see. And I think that if I had to think about my white American acquaintances that have mental health journeys to share in comparison to those of my South Asian ones, this obviously isn't true for every time, but I think that my non-South Asian acquaintances did things such as psych evaluations, therapy, medications in adolescence, because maybe someone like school staff or their parents made them do it. Whereas I feel like South Asians, including myself, go on their own will and when they have the capacity to when they're adults.
Yes, for sure. And I think to combine both of your points in regards to the parents' attitude and just the culture in South Asia, I think a lot of the times just the discussions and the language that's used in South Asian cultures is completely foreign to non-South Asian perspectives. Like, I remember like some of the some of the exclamations that we use, or some of the just the phrasing of words that we use might be completely unheard of and might be alarming to those who are coming in from an outside perspective. So I think that also adds another angle to it. But I definitely agree with a parent perspective. It's really important because whatever you practice or whatever your attitudes and beliefs are, that really influences your children's perspective. So I think in addition to just talking a little bit more about the culture, I'd say a lot of the times that language itself, it's hard to communicate. So I think that's also, how do you say in your native language or the language that you communicate with your parents, some of the things that we're so accustomed to hearing, like things like mental health, things like awareness regarding that. So I think
I
that's
asked
definitely
my parents how to say mental health in Hindi when trying to come up with the title for my book, and they had no idea. They only knew
exactly.
how to say mental sickness, for example.
Exactly, exactly. And even the English word like mental health, like we were talking with some of our advisors in CWC as well, and they were like, should we change the title because we don't want it to sound off-putting? But even like here, especially with a a very much North American perspective, that is the phrase to use. But hearing words like mental and like even you said like translating that to sickness, it's sometimes hard or it's difficult to make the like it gets lost in translation a little bit.
So, and I think that has to do with pushing. I think that has to do with promoting the mindset. If you have physical health, you also have mental health. But there's a difference between mental health and mental illness or sickness or disorder, whatever word.
Definitely, definitely.
And I think it's also like historically, if you see, mental health was always seen as illness or dysfunction. And then when you add like the stigma, that kind of makes it like a skewed mindset for people for looking at, well-being. And Mrinal, I can totally relate that, when you look at wellness or mental health, there is no particular term in Hindi. And also the language that we use, the connotation, like, if you look at how media kind of health is like, everything is backy or, you're out of your mind. It kind of makes it feel like, it's abnormal and not a normal function, which in itself is an issue because, we are so fine by saying, oh, my child fell and they broke their leg and they are in cast. But we will never say, oh, my child is really struggling with mental health because it's going to be seen as also like, what are you doing? Maybe something is wrong with your way of raising your children. So there is a lot of stigma, even from the parental side. It's kind of seen as you not being a good parent. And that's what I try to bring awareness in my cohort, like as first generation immigrant trying to raise kids, is to kind of normalize that it's okay. Like it's not seen as it's not kind of your fault, like or your lack of something. And I think that's how that language trickles down to the youth or the children. And I also feel that as parents, it's our responsibility to give language to an emotion. And many times we don't know, we don't have the language for the emotion we are feeling, so we will call it whatever. And I think that's what the children see. So but if you say, okay, it seems like you are struggling with or you're having difficulty with, then kids can also talk about it in that aspect. So again, we need to bring in language for those emotions.
And I will add, I'll put on my journalist hat on right now and go back to the point where she brought up media. So I think that, as a journalist who works for American media, I haven't worked in Indian media before, I've come to notice that. So a few years ago, I was in group therapy, and one of the participants said that he has quote unquote high functioning bipolar disorder. And he was talking about how much he hesitates to tell people that he has it until he really knows them super well. And he said to me, or he said to us, every time a mass shooting takes place, the media reports that the suspect is schizophrenic or bipolar. So I say this to say that I feel another pattern I picked up on when I talked to people and told their stories is this ideology that having a mental health disorder is associated with something like schizophrenia or bipolar, like something that scares people. And I have said that I feel like part of the solution from a reporter standpoint is now that we're covering stories about mental health awareness month when it rolls around and stuff, we shouldn't just talk about those types of stories like that have to do with like psychosis recovery. We should also talk about things like social anxiety disorder, OCD, ADHD, mild depression, to further educate people that mental health is a spectrum that all of us are on, all of us have been on, or have the potential to be on in the future.
Yeah, relating to that, I'm currently in high school, and um, I do feel like there is a stigma around talking about mental health, and because really, I feel a lot of times I'm nervous to go approach my parents and talk to them about my own mental health. So, like a lot of the times when I'm speaking to someone outside of my family about this, they're like, go talk to your parents, you know, like uh, your family knows best. They've been through this, but it's just it's really hard to speak to someone who has grown up in a completely different way because my parents were immigrants and they didn't grow up here. I mean, it brings me to my brings me to one of my next questions. Because youth with like minority backgrounds or youth that are parts of different marginalized groups, they are often like they don't realize or they don't fully understand the way mental health is portrayed in the U.S. because often it's portrayed only with white cisgender youth in mind. And I was um, my question was like, how does that affect the youth, and what are some ways to look past just the white and cisgender lens when talking about mental health in the youth?
I can share because again, like you're right. Like if you look at the institutions, how they were made, or the teachings that are given to us is from a very colonial perspective. It's like they our mindsets are we have to decolonize our mindsets to understand that when we talk about mental health or when we talk about from a cultural perspective, we come from a collective framework, whereas here it's a very individualistic mindset, right? So our kids, or when I say like South Asian children or youth, when they think about, so there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of shame. Oh, I'm not a good enough kid, or I'm going to burden my parents with something, right? So I think that's also a responsibility. And again, I'm sharing this from something that my kids have gone through, right? And through that I have learned that, oh, when I don't say it, like it's the same thing, like when if you are from LGBTQ community, it makes a lot of difference when you see a rainbow somewhere, so that you're looking for it, you're looking for that sign that it's okay for me to feel safe. So I think it's the same perspective, and as a parent I normalize that for my children, right? Then they feel confident that they can ask, because there are not that many role models out there, and the institutions don't understand the lens that we come from, right? Like why is a South Asian youth fearful of even bringing up a mental health challenge at home? It's not that their parents are not supportive, it's just that there is a lot of like shame, or like I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough. So I think from that perspective it is very important to educate parents and educate the school systems and educate the youth that it's okay, because these institutions or these mindsets were built from a particular mindset, right? So I think that creates awareness and openness, and much needed. It's like that little ray of hope that somebody is looking for. Should I go? Should I not go? It shouldn't be like that. There shouldn't be any hesitancy. But again, it's the historical stigma and shame, and it's institutional and it's cultural too. So we all have to collectively work together to disrupt this and demystify this.
So I will echo what she said about the colonial systems. So even though mental health has a stigma that exists just about anywhere and everywhere, at the same time, it's like mental health is seen as a white norm. Going to therapy, taking psychiatric medicines, going to a hospital is seen as a white norm. And I think that decolonization is a big part of overcoming the stigma and encouraging more people to go. And I think that in my book, for example, there was a big emphasis from the folks that I talked to about wanting or liking working with a professional who was of the same ethnic background or religion as them, because that means you don't have to do as much educating and explaining on why your family thinks the way they think and acts the way they do. So I feel as though if more brown people would work in the field, it would make even the older generation of immigrants at least a little bit less hesitant to seek help, because they're working with someone who speaks their language, both literally and figuratively.
Definitely. And I think I wanted to highlight a point that Mohini made about the gender aspect of it, because I think there's especially growing up in high school, like in Satvik's perspective of, I just wanted to share that, like, it was so unheard of, but even when I was in high school, to have to for anyone who was non-binary. I knew exactly, like literally one person in my entire high school who used they, them pronouns. But today in my university, like this is what, 8 years later, in my final year, half of the people that I work with in my staff on campus uses they, them pronouns. So I think it's so for me, I'm just visually seeing that representation of people like understanding that gender is more fluid than they might have learned it to be is really the groundbreaking, because so many people are realizing that about themselves. It's not like these people didn't, people have experienced this for centuries, but only now we're having these terms and these conversations and allowing those who have felt that way to openly express it. But I will say, it's almost unheard of to find South Asians who utilize they, them pronouns, or South Asian people who identify as non-binary. So I'd like to ask, like, what are some ways that we can support youth who might have, not necessarily struggles, but who might have difficulty expressing their gender identity or understanding their gender identity? What are some ways that we can facilitate that, especially from a South Asian background, when it's almost nearly unheard of? And like we said, there's no language for that.
All I can think of is if there were more professionals in the field that have a high degree of experience working with those communities, then they'll be able to connect with those who are feeling insecure about it much better than someone who is not in the South Asian community and doesn't have to deal with those same sorts of barriers when it comes to the stigma surrounding gender identity.
Yeah, and I would also add that it all comes down to education and awareness. And again, like, as a parent, raising like two children, my older child is non-binary, and my husband and I, we learn like to use they, them, and explain that in our language there is no term, like there is no actual translation, because our language is not gendered, right? So but again, there are ways that we can I think, and again, that comes back to awareness. Like sometimes parents are hesitant also because they don't understand, because they have not experienced that. They don't understand why it's important, because it's kind of seen as kind of like American way of thinking, or it's revolutionary, like, or you don't have anything. Like, why does it matter? Why is it important? Like, why do we have to, right? So the more there is awareness and education around that why does it matter for somebody? It was, if I was not in the field that I am in, and I'm not working the way I work in an environment where I work with older adults, and we work with LGBTQ community, right? And I also believe in like diversity, equity, inclusion, and I understand like there are so many things that impact somebody's well-being. So I was thinking, like, if I didn't, like, I went to Boston College, I did my master's here. So even though I'm first generation immigrant that came up in my 20s over here 20 years ago, I got some exposure, I got that understanding, but my peers, my age group of parents who are trying to raise, they don't know anything about this. They don't understand why it's important. So I would also say that to youth, that sometimes don't discount or don't just say it's not important, my parents are not going to understand. Sometimes it's also our responsibility to make them understand like why it's important and have that, you know. But then I would also add that we need to have more role models. We need to have more people who are coming out, people who are trying to kind of normalize this, because it should, the more people talk about it in all generations, that's how, again, it's going to change. It'll begin when both generations come together and make it like why it's important and why it's important to address.
And I think the multiple generation part is something that I definitely want to talk about, because I'd say, because for example, Sadvik and I are apart by 5 academic years. So I have a little bit of more of a different perspective. I graduated high school in 2018. And I think even the friends that I have had at the time, the friends that I know now, this stuff is still very new to them. it's not as common as it was 5 years ago. Like I just gave an example. Like when I was in high school, there was one person. Now I can just start listing off people. So this is a question for Satvik. I'd say, what do you think the current attitude is in your perspective as a South Asian high school student right now, currently, in regards to mental health and gender identity? What are your perspectives on that, Satvik?
In terms of mental health, I mean, personally for me, if I want to address my own mental health, and try to put my own mental health first, it would honestly just be me, spending time with my friends. But that's often seen as like a distraction from like by a lot of for like from more important things like college and school and grades. Just like the pattern that I've seen is just that mental health often takes, it's like it's seen as the least important thing. Like you do all of your required things like school and making sure you're doing well in all parts of your life, and then if you have time, you take care of your mental health. Um, that's been kind of like a pattern that I've been seeing for like my entire time in high school, especially in a place as competitive as where I live in the Bay Area, where yeah, it's just college, 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 and there's kids like taking like 13, 14 APs and just not putting as much of a focus on their mental health as they should. In terms of like just how like how it looks in our school in terms of like diversity, in terms of the gender identity of people, it's like I think it's definitely changed. There's a lot more people, at least at my school, who are comfortable with expressing their own gender identity. Um, uh, we do have like multiple clubs at least around campus, and these are honestly the norm at most schools in our area, like the Gender Sexuality Alliance, and just a place for people with different gender identities to feel safe and at home. Like it's not because it's not as much as I'd like to say everyone is fully accepted. There's still a lot of just hate and biases against people that are just different from the norm. And yeah, I guess that's how I would describe the current environment for most of the teenagers that are in the Bay Area at least.
Yeah, and just before we move on to our next point, I did want to add, so Satvik and I also went to high school in the same city, and I think it's notoriously known for being very competitive in relation to academics. So it's almost as if there's no time for anything else. There's no time to address your gender identity. There's no time to address, your mental health. There's no time to address anything other than things that will benefit, like Satvik said, your chances or opportunities of going to the college of either your choice or your family's choice or your parents' choice. So there's just not time for a lot. There's other things. So I think both of us have that shared perspective of being in that very highly competitive academic environment. Everything, every other moment, if it's not academics, is still related to yourself and how you can improve yourself. But it's never about, appeasing that inner self of yourself. Like you're, addressing the inner self and, dedicating time to improving that, because I think a lot of my friends struggled in that regard and did not have time for themselves and resorted to drug usage or excessive drinking because they just needed that opportunity to feel something. And I think it's also important to understand that a lot of the times you can find that solace or that community in your friends. Like you had mentioned, like if you have any mental health things you want to talk about, your friends are a great resource. So having that community and having that awareness amongst people your age is very beneficial.
Yeah, in terms of like just the college rush in for a lot of high schoolers now, I think one major issue that I've noticed is like oftentimes kids in high school are so focused on getting into the college of their dreams, they end up going to their college and end up having nothing that they're passionate about anymore. And it's like the one driving thing in their lives has just disappeared. And honestly, it's such a huge problem because like so many kids, it's just like it's in their heads that of their entire point of existence at this point is just like in high school is just to get into a good college, and once you're there you're set, I guess. And but then once we're there, it's just like we've spent so much time trying to get to a college of our dreams. We've never really developed ourselves and our own passions and interests, and our mental health is already deteriorated to a state where it's like um I mean, that's why we see all sorts of kids like getting like alcohol poisoning, and like there's drug abuse in colleges like a lot. And I think that a huge portion of that is because of the kind of mindset that many high schoolers have before they get into college.
Definitely. So do you want to lead into another question, Satvik?
Yeah, another question that that was that I wanted to ask was, I mean, it was related to like having like our taking care of our own mental health being less important. Um, so oftentimes parents see like mental like activities that help our own mental health as silly or just distractions from life. Like how would we address that, and how would we spread the message that mental health um, should take importance over other things in our lives?
I think again, from a parent's perspective, what I would say is like, your kids are watching you. That's the message that I would say. It's how we take care of our mental health. Like, why is self-care important? And again, coming from a social work background, we are taught in school because, we hear, we have to take care. You cannot give out from an empty cup, right? So you have to fill your cup every so often, only then you'll be able to pour something out of it. So it's the attitude of the parent. What are your conversation like? Are the dinner conversations about, brushing off that, mental health or self-care is only for people who have time? Or like even like, oh, you should get busy. It's, you don't have time for all this nonsense. Like I hear other parents and, other people talking, oh, the kid has too much time. That's why now everybody's talking about mental health. How is that everybody is now having depression or anxiety or all that? It's like people who have nothing. I have to work 3 jobs. I don't have time for this, right? So we are role models, how we kind of say, okay, we might be doing 3 jobs, but it's still important for me to take care of myself. And for the youth, I remember my child when they were going for therapy, one of the things that I asked them is that now that you are in therapy, you are taking medication, now, what is different for you? And they said to me that, Mom, what I realized is that things that really help, as kids, we think it's silly. Like, how you talk about, positive affirmations or, doing those journaling of thoughts and writing this down, or doing the gratitude journal, or doing things like 3 positive things before you sleep. I used to think they were silly, but now that I am doing it and I'm seeing the impact, I realize, like how important it was. So I would say, again, as parents, we have to model that for our children. And also, I would caution, like Susan David does amazing job about positive toxicity. That's another thing that we as parents need to be very careful for. Like, just talking about positive thing doesn't mean that there is no negativity. And we have to be careful. Like we have to acknowledge and say, I'm having a hard day. But you know what? Because I have done that, I have lived this, I'll be able to take care of it. Not always brush it off as like, oh, just think positive, or, listen to positive podcasts and everything is going to be fine. So we have to be little careful about making it known to people that these are the strategies that work, but you have to come up with your own strategies. But it's not going to be easy. It's okay to feel that it's not easy. So don't make it always like, oh, if you're not doing better, it's because you're not trying hard enough.
I think that it's about promoting the mindset that taking care of your mental health is equally as important as taking care of your physical health. And when those things are out of line, then other things in your life are going to be out of line as well. And I think that it's about balance too, which is something I feel like I wasn't necessarily taught about much growing up. About realizing that as badly as you want your kid to grow up and be successful and survive in the world, they're still a kid. They still deserve to enjoy life, and I think that this wasn't modeled in our community because what should I think that people who immigrated here are in that constant state of survival mindset and don't really take the time to look at, they're more focused on survival, I think, than things like self-actualization and self-fulfillment. And that mindset kind of gets projected onto the generations following. And I will say one person in my book even said to me that who told her story that she thinks brown parents do not take their kids' mental health seriously unless they reveal they're on meds.
I think that's a great segue to kind of like, what are some coping mechanisms that we can offer? Because Mohini, you mentioned that that think positive I think positive mindset is not necessarily always going to be the most beneficial. It's very one-sided. And Mrinal, you were mentioning something similar as well, like, you know, before getting to a point where, you know, medication is needed, like how can we address it before and be open and honest? And what are some coping mechanisms that can be utilized from any youth perspective? Like what are some of the coping mechanisms?
We all have to come up with our own coping strategies, because, you know, what will work for me might not work for Mrinal and might not work for you, Satvik, you know. So I think we all have to be open to kind of trying different things. And so first having that awareness that, you know, this is a process. It's not an end in itself. And it's a lifelong thing, just the way you would train your body, you know, you build resistance over a period of time, you build stamina and strength over a period of time. It's not a one-shot deal. So having that recognition that, you know, that we all have to come up with our own coping mechanisms. And that's where, you know, having that trusted somebody that you can talk to, whether it's a family member or a trusted adult, whether it's your parents or somebody in your circle, could be a first start. But then if you are, you know, if you are able to see a therapist and you are able to build those life skills, then it's a long-term investment that you have to do, and it's okay. And again, that would depend on, you know, the comfortability of your own being able to ask for help, seek for help, and then following through the regimen, um, and also having that conversation with your parents that why it's important, because, you know, you have to build those coping skills depending on, you know, and then again, this is from my experience with my older child, that, you know, they realize that, you know, there can be different kinds of coping mechanisms. Some people do emotional eating, some people play video games or do other things to escape, and some people, you know, exercise. Some people might go for a walk. They might be, you know, go for a hike in the nature, or listen to a music that picks them up, or just, you know, having some sort of understanding or buddy system with their own peers, that, you know, I'm really having a hard day, you know, this will be my code for you, you know. Like sometimes we do that, like and we created those routines in my household, that I would say that if you see mom doing this, you know, tell me, because that means I'm not having positive coping skills, right? So having those dialogues sometimes helps. But again, I would encourage everybody to figure out their own, whatever will work for them. But having conversation, that's the first step.
Yes, definitely.
I agree with the part where she said that different things work for different people, and that's a message that I'm hoping to convey in my book too, with the variety of stories that I told. One person in the book even said that the biggest thing they learned was that healing is nonlinear, and that what may work for one person may not work for another. Now, since you asked about things like medicines and how not to get to that point if possible, one thing I read is when you feel like you're struggling, ask yourself, are things like my sleep, my exercise, my diet, my career, the people that I'm surrounded by, out of alignment in some way, and see if it's possible to address those things. And if those things are in alignment and you're still struggling, maybe there is something bigger going on. Or if it's not possible to kind of fix those things out of alignment, then maybe just putting a band-aid on it for the time being may be the solution.